Welcome back to another installment of r/no sleep. Today, a story from author Skull Knitter. Title: I work at a 24-hour pet ER, and we had a patient that wasn't an animal. Just as a trigger warning, this story is marked for animal abuse. I do not know what I'm reading. Anytime I read these, it's on the fly, and then I do some editing afterwards. But that's just a heads up. Anybody that is sensitive to that, I recommend turning it off at this point. So let's get into it. The man walked in at 2 a.m., dragging something black behind him. The way it was moving, it didn't sit right. Neither did he. The receptionist felt it immediately. The way he walked, stiff and uneven, like a scarecrow with one leg shorter than the other. He hid greasy blonde hair beneath a 10-gallon hat, spurs clicking as he moved. I watched the security footage later. His lips were white and thin, his teeth crooked. His mouth twisted into a half smile, like he was seconds from laughter. He was dragging a massive black Rottweiler. The dog resisted, back paws sliding across the floor. The camera didn't pick up sound, but later, the two gals at reception told me what he said. "He acting possessed." They handed him intake forms. He hobbled back to a bench, and I watched through the lens as another client holding a cat carrier subtly slid a few seats away from him. I looked up his paperwork. The address led to some warehouse out in the scrublands, 3 states away. The name seemed fake too. Keaton? No records. No online presence. It didn't seem to fit him. But the dog's name, Mutt, that was the only detail I believed. You might wonder why I checked. It's not standard protocol, but I don't usually do this. But the events of the last few nights led me to my search. When he handed the paperwork back, he sat back down again, dragging the dog with him like a sack of flour. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes fixed ahead. He barely moved, like a corpse propped upright. His dog didn't move much either, just sat there, waiting. We see a lot of characters here, some genuinely kind folks too, but this man? Something about him was wrong. I stepped into the lobby to bring him into an exam room. It took him a second to register me, like he was in a trance. And then the smell hit me, stale cigarettes, gas fumes, and beneath that, something worse. A rotten, greasy stench that clung to the air. The dog sat still, vacant, a husk. It's like someone had lobotomized it. As I stood there, drool began dripping from its mouth, pooling on the floor. I introduced myself and got to work. "So, what's going on with the mutt today?" Keaton didn't answer me right away. Keaton. I'm gonna say Keaton. Guessing it's Keaton. Keaton sounds ridiculous. We'll just call him Keaton. Keaton didn't seem to answer right away. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, like he was watching something flutter above us. "Oh, he just ain't acting right. He ain't been eating much." This is usually where the client starts rambling. Some could go on for hours if you let them, but he was done, still staring at the ceiling through those dirty locks of hair. When I knelt to take the dog's heart rate, the second my fingers touched its skin, a wrongness crawled into me. That tingle before lightning strikes, that creeping dread when something awful is about to happen. The vitals were normal, the heart rate, breathing, but its skin was cold. Its temperature was 97 degrees, lower than we like. I tented its skin, saw it was mildly dehydrated. But when I peeled back its loose lips to check its gums, I felt like I was too close to something I shouldn't be. The gums were pale, the pupils locked onto me, dilated. It wasn't growling, no hackles raised, just watching, like it was restraining itself. That feel of unease was sickening. "Don't you turn your back on him," the man said. I paused mid-turn. "Excuse me?" "If you're gonna walk away from him, do it facing. Otherwise, something bad might happen." I exhaled sharply, irritated. He watched me get close to the dog, lean in, take its temperature, listen to its heart rate. Yet now was the time he decided to warn me it was aggressive? I liked the situation less and less. The man, the dog, the way this whole situation ached in my gut. I backed away, facing the dog. It watched me, intently, like I was prey, like I was meat. A few moments later, our on-site emergency veterinarian, Dr. Harcum, came in. Old school, no nonsense. He and Keaton exchanged a few words. The vet recommended blood work and an overnight stay with an IV fluid drip. The dog needed warming too. Keaton never lost that dumb smile, that half-cocked grin, like something was hilarious. But he nodded, accepted the treatment plan. We went to take the dog into the back treatment area. I slipped the muzzle on, of course. And that's when I noticed how the dog refused to walk. The owner had dragged it behind him earlier, but now it was lethargic. I could see in its eyes it was choosing not to move. I had a larger male staff member, Ryan, carry the dog for me. As he picked it up, he glanced at me. We didn't exchange words, but I knew he felt it too. Not just the dog, the air. When he went to draw blood from its jugular, it didn't even react. Ryan held the dog steady, hands firm on either side of its head, jaws up. The needle slipped in, the syringe filled, the blood was cold. I ran it through the machines, just mild dehydration. Some elevated lipase hinting at pancreatitis. No infection, nothing to explain why it was so cold. We placed it into a heated kennel, tucked it in with blankets, hooked up the IV catheter. I was relieved when Keaton left. This was 3 days ago. So he came in, he brought this possible zombie dog. At this point, we're not really sure what's going on. I think it was just supposed to be an overnight stay, and he's just like, see ya. And he just danced out of there. Interesting why he played the game as long as he did. I'm intrigued. I love the way that Skullknitter writes. It's so captivating. It makes me just want to keep reading. So let's do it. The night was quiet, rare for an emergency hospital. We had another dog kenneled 2 spaces down from the Rottweiler. It was a cattle dog that had undergone emergency laparotomy. It had been doing fine, normal vitals, good appetite, responsive. 2 hours later, I checked in on it, and the cattle dog was dead. It had torn open its own incision. Somehow, it had gotten its cone off and had attacked itself, not licking, not nibbling, it was destroying itself. Even when the coils of intestine unfurled from its abdomen, it had kept biting at those loose guts, like they were coiled snakes and he was killing them. The dog was slouched over, head limp against the floor. The blood ran in bright ribbons, swirling towards the kennel drain behind him, which slurped up the blood greedily. The kennel was a bloodbath. It streaked the walls, splattered the ceiling. His intestines had leaked bile and partially digested sludge. The cattle dog's eyes were vacant orbs, glistening in the light. I stood still for a moment, taking in the horror, the violence, and 2 kennels down sat Mutt, sitting, watching. Fluid drip running, heater humming, lips curled back, no panting, no whining, just smiling. His eyes reflected the fluorescent light, and for 1 sickening second they looked almost human. Dr. Harkham made the call, but I heard every word, every choked sob within the thin walls of our office. The owner didn't just cry, they wailed. I'd seen plenty of death in this job, but this was different. This wasn't bad luck, something else had its hands in this. The mood in the hospital shifted. In all of my years, I'd never seen a dog unzip itself like a gym bag and spill out its intestines. Each time we walked past Mutt's kennel, his head turned slowly to follow. Each bloody towel, each mop bucket, every time we passed the cattle dog-sized body bag, zip-tied and labeled, Mutt watched. That night was quiet, but it didn't feel like a break. It felt like I was watching thunderheads forming in the distance, the promise of something worse to come. At some point, hours after the cattle dog's death, I heard the steady beeping of a monitor from the kennel ward. It was the IV pump hooked to Mutt. I didn't want to go over there, but I did. I brought Ryan. We zipped the muzzle over Mutt's head easily. Too easily. He didn't resist, didn't flinch, just let it happen. His eyes followed the movement of our hands as we buckled it snugly behind his head. Only his eyes moved. 2 dark orbs, watching, digesting. The dog had kinked the IV line beneath its paw. We moved it aside, smoothed it out. That should have been it, a simple fix. But as we turned to leave, the light above his kennel flickered. At first, just a slight flicker, barely noticeable. Then it sputtered, dimmed, cut out completely. The kennel dropped into shadow. Ryan and I froze. Meanwhile, this dude's just sleeping, sawing logs. The only light now was a faint glow from the hallway behind us. We exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge what we were feeling. The air in the room changed, heavy, buzzing, like the static before a storm. Then the two tube lights above Mutt's kennel flared so bright it hurt to look at them. A pop, then a sizzle, and they died. Everything was silent. Ryan's back was to Mutt. Mutt lunged. It was a surge of violence. Even with the muzzle strapped tight, a blur of black as Mutt's body lunged forward. The muzzle face rammed against Ryan's side, brutally smashing him again and again. Ryan screamed. The dog was silent, except for the mechanical snapping of his jaws, working beneath the muzzle, spittle flying. Ryan twisted, trying to stand, but the sudden attack had him off guard. I reacted without thinking. I threw open the kennel door. Mutt rammed into Ryan again, harder this time. The sheer force knocked him off balance. Ryan writhed around to grab Mutt. The moment he faced Mutt, the dog stilled. It stood there, silent, watching, bathed in the new darkness. Something was wrong with this dog. Not neurologically, something deeper. It felt intelligent. It felt calculating. It felt evil. Ryan was shaken, and so was I. He showed me the large purple bruise blooming in the skin beneath his ribs. God, it was huge. But neither of us had any further inclination to talk about it. The rest of the night passed without incident. I focused on my other cases for the night. I saw a Chihuahua with pneumonia, a Persian cat having low-grade seizures, a tabby with proprioception defectitis. We went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. Ryan seemed dazed, like something fresh had broken inside of him. It wasn't just shock or trauma or fear. It was more profound than that. I left for the night still shaken. Ryan didn't even wave goodbye. I chain-smoked cigarettes in my car before driving home, flicked the butts out the window. My hands were shaking the entire ride. And when I finally collapsed into bed, I pulled my pistol out of my purse and slipped it under my pillow. And as the sun crept over the horizon, my dreams were wrong. I dreamed of a black face snarling in the dark, leaning in, sniffing, eyes like hollow pits, endless swirling galaxies within. I felt the faraway stinging of teeth sinking into my flesh. Not a bite, not an attack, but a slow, deliberate pressure, easing into my skin. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat. When I came in for my shift that night, I felt a deep sense of disappointment the second I walked past Mutt's kennel. He was still there, heater purring, eyes following. The lights above his kennel were still blown out. The ones beside them had started to flicker. Ryan called out sick, said he'd been throwing up since the night before. I had a feeling there was more to the story, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I shot him a text wishing him well. He read it, didn't reply. And that sinister, eerie man who called himself Keaton, his phone went straight to dial tone when we tried calling for a case update. He wasn't coming back. He paid half his bill up front in crisp, old $100 bills. We weren't getting the other half. The night was busier. I told my manager we shouldn't put any of the dogs in that ward, but we didn't have a choice. Our small animal ward was on the other side of the building, but for the larger dogs, they had to go there. We admitted a Great Dane with liver disease. There was nowhere else to put him, so I placed him in the kennel furthest from Mutt, 2 down from the cattle dog that had ripped itself apart. I went back to check on them 10 minutes later. I stopped cold. Mutt's kennel was wide open. The latch was undone. The door swung open. He wasn't on fluids anymore. No pump to beep, no leash, no sign of how it had happened. Just him sitting at the threshold, staring, slack-jawed. I shut the kennel, latched it securely, left the room, came back with 2 plates of food. Immediately, I felt nauseous. The kennel was open again. I hadn't heard a sound, hadn't seen the door move. The only way to unlatch these kennels is with hands, with opposable thumbs. I slammed it shut again, this time locking it with a makeshift carabiner clip. I slid 1 plate of food under each kennel. I gave low-fat wet food for the Dane and critical care wet food for Mutt. I was walking away when I heard it, a sound that froze me. Not a growl, not a whine. It sounded like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water, like a deep, male voice gargling on words before spitting them out. A dog trying to talk. I turned. Mutt sat there, watching, silent now. Something tingled in the air. But the Dane had begun to cry. His plate of food lay spilled across the kennel floor. His hackles were raised, his body pressed against the back wall, eyes flickering towards the ceiling. He was feeling something deep and inexplicable. I felt it too. When I reached for his kennel bars, the crying stopped. The Dane's body trembled, then his whimpering changed. It deepened into a low, eerie sound, like a tornado siren. Then it stopped altogether. The dog went still, too still. Then all at once, he attacked his own leg, not chewing, not licking, ripping, breaking. Deep, pulverizing bites. Bone cracked. Blood spattered the kennel floor. It wasn't a dog in pain. It wasn't a dog in distress. It was something else. Something destroying itself with purpose. I couldn't go in there. If I did, he'd likely redirect onto me, sending me to the hospital. I turned and ran, shouting for help as I sprinted through the clinic. Dr. Harcum and two other techs, Angie and Denise, came rushing out of the exam room at the sound of my frantic screaming. I grabbed a rabies catch pole. The Dane was still going. The flesh of its leg hung in shreds, barely attached. Blood spurted like shots from a water gun, pulsing in rhythm with its heartbeats from a severed artery. I slipped open the kennel and looped the catch pole around its neck, tightening it hard, wrenching its head just enough to stop it from lunging. It snapped at the air, frantic, but no emotion behind it. Then it latched onto the metal pole, not out of panic, not out of rage, but out of bizarre corruption of instinct. The sound was unbearable, teeth breaking against metal, splintering, shattering. The flesh of its leg was nearly gone, just a ragged mess of meat and exposed bone that flapped as it chewed at the metal. I saw part of a fractured canine fall out of its mouth. The catch pole was bloody, dented, but holding firm. The dog was weakening by the time Dr. Harcum arrived, slumping over in a pile of its own blood. By the time we managed to inject a sedative, it was too late. The blood loss was too severe. The Dane fully collapsed to the floor, body twitching, biting. All at once, its eyes glazed over, and it went still. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mutt, lips pulled back in a snarl, smiling. This dog, it's evil. This dog need to go, it's evil. When is that fucking dog going to leave? I snapped, pointing at him. Dr. Harcum shot me a sharp look. His white coat was streaked with blood. His eyes were dark, hollowed with exhaustion. Something's wrong with it, I insisted. With him. All I see is a dog who just mutilated itself in our care, he said. The second one in 2 days. Don't worry about that fucking dog. We have bigger issues here. I have another owner to call. Another person I have to tell their pet killed itself under my watch. He flicked blood from his fingers, dragging a sleeve across his face. He was years past burnout, a shell of his former self. He couldn't see what I saw. He couldn't see the way Mutt watched, the way his eyes lingered over the carnage pulling beneath my feet, like he was enjoying it. Dr. Harcum sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. We tried calling that creepy bastard again, numbers out of service. He ditched the dog on us. That meant we had to rehome it. It could take weeks. It couldn't take weeks with him. None of us could. And as I looked into Angie's eyes, I knew she felt the same. The hospital settled into an uneasy silence. The night shift pressed on, but something had shifted. We were all exhausted, hollowed out by what we'd seen. The cattle dog, the Great Dane, the blood. Mutt sat in his kennel, untouched food at his feet, heater humming, watching. 2 more lights flickered out while I cleaned. I mopped the blood from the floors, the thick iron scent clinging to my skin. The towels we used to soak up the mess were soaked through, a deep, ugly red. And through it all, Mutt never looked away. I told myself I'd figure something out. I just need time. But time wasn't on my side. I was dumping a load of bloody towels into the laundry bin when I heard it. Allison. I dropped everything. A voice, thick and wet, slurred in a way no dog's throat was built to produce. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a growl. It was trying to speak, and what came out wasn't just sound, it was a name. My name, Allison. I turned, stomach lurching. Mutt was sitting in his kennel, still, muzzle slack, drool pulling on the blanket beneath him. His pupils swallowed the light. I couldn't move. My brain was trying to rationalize it, trying to shove what I had just heard into a box of normalcy. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was the pipes, or a monitor, But then the smell hit me. Rot. Not just the smell of the hospital, not just the faint antiseptic and animal musk that always clung to the air. This was meat left in the sink for weeks. This was something dead wedged into the cracks of the world. And I realized then, the smell I'd caught when Keaton first walked into the lobby, that greasy, putrid stench. It had to have been him. It had to have been the dog. I ran. I grabbed the blankets off the floor, shoved them into the laundry bin, and bolted. My hand shook as I crammed the lid shut. My pulse was a hammer in my ears. Don't turn your back on it. The memory of Keaton's words crawled down my spine like a cold hand. He's acting possessed. I knew what Mutt had tried to do to Ryan. I knew what he wanted to do to me. And now I knew I wasn't waiting for him to act. I was going to kill him. I kept my head down the rest of the shift, biding my time. My mind wasn't on the cases I took. I worked on autopilot. I went through the motions. My body was moving without me. And when I got a moment alone, I pulled up 20 ml of pentobarbital sodium and phenatone sodium solution, euthanol, the sparkling pink liquid we use to put animals down. I took enough to kill a dog twice Mutt's size. There'd be a discrepancy in the controlled substance log, but I could smooth it over the next few weeks. A couple of slightly higher doses of euthanasia cases, logged with enough time between them, and no one would notice. I locked the cabinet, slid the syringe into my pocket. I was committing a crime, breaking DEA laws. I could lose my license, my career, even end up in jail. But deep in my bones, I knew one thing. That thing in the kennel, whatever it was, it needed to die. It's like G.I. Jane coming in and taking care of business. She's bad. I like her. She's a good character. Even though she's terrified, she knows that something needs to be done, or this thing's gonna keep killing, and it ain't gonna stop. The next morning, when I arrived for my shift, the hospital was heavy with grief. Everyone was crying. Ryan was dead. He'd taken his own life in his trailer sometime after leaving work. No details, no explanation. Just gone. The police had come to inform us. They didn't stay long. They didn't need to. I knew then, it cemented in my mind what had to be done. I didn't know how, but I knew. I didn't wait. I worked through the grief, through the horror, pushing it all into a place I'd deal with later. I waited for the right moment, a lull between shift changes, when staffing was light. I approached Mutt's kennel. His head was cocked, eyes tracking me. He looked almost expectant. I opened the kennel door and slid the muzzle over his face quickly. My hands moved with a sharpness I hadn't felt before. I yanked the straps too tight. My pulse was steady. I leaned out of the room, peered around the corner. No one coming. I held Mutt's paw, feeling for the vein. My other hand had already slipped a needle beneath the skin. The syringe in my palm felt hot. I pushed the plunger. It was difficult, so much volume to inject. But I pushed it all, every last drop. Normally, when an animal is euthanized, it happens fast. They slump, their eyes stay open, their body gives up. He didn't move. I could have killed a human with this much euthanol, but he just sat there. I stared at him, heart pounding, my breath becoming sharp. They usually pass away before the syringe is empty. Their bodies relax, their eyes go distant, the tension of life slipping from them like a sigh. Mutt's body stayed rigid, his breathing steady. The drug should have shut him down immediately, but his muscles held. His head remained lifted, eyes locked onto mine. A chill crawled up my spine. This dog should be dead. Then the hallway lights flickered. One by one, the bulbs sizzled out, plunging the kennel ward into darkness. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The heater stopped. The only glow came from the exit sign at the far end of the hall, casting a weak green wash over the kennels. The shadows twisted around me. I couldn't move. The door to the kennel slammed shut behind me. My breath hitched. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the slow, wet rasp of Mutt's breathing. I could feel him in the dark, the weight of his presence gnawing at the air. Allison. The voice came from the kennel, thick, gurgling, wrong. A sound like a dog learning to speak, like a throat filled with gravel trying to shape words. The vowels stretched, dipping into something slick and inhuman. My stomach lurched. I reached for the latch, fingers fumbling, but my hands were slick with sweat. My breathing was too loud. The darkness pressed in. The rot smell thickened, crawling up my throat. Then I felt it. A cold, dead hand closed around my ankle. I choked on a scream. My body jolted as something gripped me, nails pressing into my skin, curling against the fabric of my scrubs. The air turned electric, static snapping against my skin. I turned and ran. The door gave way beneath my shoulder, and I burst into the hallway, feet pounding against the tile. Behind me, I heard the kennel door smash open, the sound of paws, heavy and fast, hitting the ground. He was coming. I sprinted blindly through the dark, my shoulder slamming into the wall as I searched for the door handle. My fingers scraped smooth wood, no knob, no latch, just cold, endless surface. Paws pounded closer. No growling, no snarling, no warning, just movement. A silent freight train barreling towards me. I spun, pressing my back against the door. The darkness was absolute, thick and suffocating. The emergency lights had died, swallowing the building in shadow. But I could hear him, breathing, slow, wet, and thick with something I couldn't name. Then, a whisper of movement, so close I felt the air shift. I bolted down the hall. No thought, no plan, just instincts. My body moved. I reached my locker, yanked it open, hands fumbling for my purse. The air behind me shifted. A weight, a presence. I felt it before I saw it. A void yawning open. My fingers closed around cold metal, the grip of my handgun. Blast that thing, blast it! I turned, raised the barrel, and fired. The first shot lit up the hall like a camera flash. In that brief flicker, I saw him, that snarling grin. The second shot, the third. His body jerked, but he didn't fall. His lips were still curled back in that awful rictus. The sixth and final shot hit its mark. The left side of his skull caved inward, the muzzle of his face blown apart. His jaw sagged open, tongue limp. And even as he fell, his head twitched. A violent, unnatural snap of movement. A thick, wet pop echoed down the hall. He swayed. Then, finally, he dropped. I stood there, gun trembling in my hands, ears ringing. The darkness still pulsed around me, thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Then, footsteps, shouts, voices. Someone grabbed my arm, yanking me back. The lights flickered, buzzed, then flared back to life. And for the first time, I saw what I had done. One shot had buried itself in the tile. The rest had hit him. Mutt lay on his side, his head in ruin of blood and bone. His chest rose once, twice. Then it went still. The bite muzzle was missing. He must have pulled it off somewhere during the chase. I didn't move. The hospital swarmed with people. Cops were called. Questions were asked. I barely registered any of it. They took me into the back office, my hands still shaking, my ears still filled with phantom echoes. I knew what I had to say. I knew how to frame it. Self-defense. I played the part well. The police let me go. Mutt was wrapped, bagged, and stuffed into our freezer, waiting for cremation. I took time off work, spent days in silence trying to erase the memory of that voice. It didn't work. The morning I was supposed to return for my shift, I got a phone call. Blocked number. I answered. Slow, shaky breathing filled the line. Then he began to laugh. Low, drawling, thick with something I couldn't name. A mouthful of tobacco chew, or blood. You shouldn't have killed it, little lady. Keaton. His voice slithered through the speaker, curling like a snake around my spine. His laughter built, rising, filling the silence. You just gone and made things so much worse. And as the laughing turned into hollering, the line clicked dead. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing. His words sank into my bones. Gone and made things so much worse? My first thought was confusion. How did he get my number? My second thought was frantic. Those words struck a chord deep inside my marrow. He said I'd made things worse. And for some reason, deep down in my soul, I believed him. Yes. Skull Knitter, your stories are like taking a shower in the rest of these stories. So refreshing, so good to read. I love your writing style. It's so good. Everybody, please, in the description, go check him out. Go leave him a post on his Reddit. Tell him how much you love the story. I know I did. Like always, please subscribe. I am the Meat Grid Masochist. Farewell.